today is organized by the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, which is a society run by a group of students united by the belief that progress in the discipline of economics will be driven by increasingly interdisciplinary approach and a pluralist platform in the 21st century. So thank you all for joining us here today for our final event of this term. And today we are joined by Professor Gareth Austin, who is a professor of economic history and a fellow at King's College here in Cambridge. So his research interest lies in both African and comparative economic history, and the latter with a particular reference to Asian and Latin America. Previously, he was an editor of the Journal of African History and one of the proposals of the new Journal of Global History, and served as president of the European Network in Universal and Global History from 2008 to 2012. He has also previously held faculty positions at universities around the world, such as the University of Birmingham, the University of Ghana, LSE, and Graduate Institute in Geneva, just to name a few. So Professor Austin, it's a real honor to have you here today, and we look forward to your presentations and on lessons for theory from Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, is everybody present an economist? I mean, are you all doing economic studies? What other degrees are being studied?
It's maths.
Maths.
Economic history.
Okay.
Maths as well.
Right. Sorry?
Land
economy. Right. And you at the back are economists?
Development studies.
Development studies.
Second year history.
Right. So I think you two might be the only economic students in the right. Well, this is intended as a easily comprehensible talk addressed to people who know little economic theory. So my interest today is primarily in economic theories as tools of economic analysis. So it's tools of historical analysis. And I'm going to review, within this perspective, the study of Africa since 1956. The central question for the literature over this 66-year period is why is Africa actually poor? I think you can see that question behind almost every publication in the field, in several disciplines: history, economics, development studies, political science, and so on. Of course, the question has been reframed over the decades. So for a lot of the 70s and 80s, it was framed in terms of the development of capitalism. Does Africa have the right kind of capitalism? And so on. Recent history, in other words, what has happened in recent years, as well as recent research, now enables us to say that Africa actually wasn't and isn't all that poor. So let me show a very simple piece of evidence for that. I could discuss the pre-colonial 18th and 19th centuries with a view to pointing out that there were episodes in particular regions where, despite our lack of quantitative data for that period, we're probably safe to believe that there was some economic growth. The colonial period, we've had a couple of attempts at constructing GDP figures for a number of British colonies in Africa, which are also more optimistic than previously thought. But the big story since independence, usually around 1960, was sort of slow but pretty consistent growth in GDP per head at the level of the continent as a whole, or the subcontinent as a whole. And then a bad period for most countries in the 80s and early 90s, not for all countries. This is the period when Ghana reversed its economic decline and did very well. Because it's such a big region, there are always some countries bucking the trend. But since the mid-90s, we've had a remarkable growth up until the 2010s. So we certainly ought not to simply assume that Africa's always the poor relation. But let's go to the emergence of the field. The reason I chose the year 1956 is that this was the year of the publication of Kenneth Dekay's book, Trade and Politics in the Niger Delta. Over here we have an indeed very colourful character, Tony Hopkins, who is still going, gave a paper at a seminar a couple of weeks ago, but this is taken much earlier in his life. And he was the biggest figure in the emergence of African economic history in the 60s and 70s. So that's the reference to Dekay's book and the reference to the book that Hopkins published in 1973 with the deliberately, if you like, boring title, because the whole point was that it was possible to write an economic history of West Africa, which many people had doubted. It was republished at the very beginning of 2020 with a long new essay referring to more recent research. So the first theory I want to talk about is something that was much debated in the early years of the field. That's to say, late 50s, 1960s, and into the 70s. Have any of you heard of Karl Polanyi? Karl Polanyi is best known outside African studies for his book The Great Transformation, 1944. But his last and indeed posthumous work was a study of what he called an archaic economy, the pre-colonial kingdom of Dahomey, now the southern part of the Republic of Benin. So he ended his life studying West Africa, and several of his students followed him to study West Africa. And they applied to West Africa very much the same argument that he put forward in The Great Transformation, except obviously specifically for Africa. Karl Polanyi was, in my reading, very much an anti-capitalist romantic, somebody who hated the idea that Adam Smith might have been right when Smith said that there was a universal tendency to truck and barter. And for Polanyi, economic rationality was a historical construct, which is an idea that tends to appeal to historians, and was one that was created under capitalism, which he dated only to the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe. So coming to Africa via colonial rule, and even then, according to Polanyi, not having made that much progress. The particular big ideas that he applied to pre-colonial Africa, specifically to the Kingdom of Dahomey, there are three specific points. One is that exchange, trade, was divided into separate spheres, each with their own special purpose currency. So there were certain things you could buy with cowrie shells, but you couldn't use cowrie shells to buy other things. And crucially, prices were set by custom or command. And in his case, in the case of Dahomey, he thought by command. So what underlies this is his belief that economic rationality would not be applicable to pre-colonial Africa, was barely applicable to even mid-20th century Africa. And by extension, the theories based upon the assumption of economic rationality would not work in African studies. This stimulated a great deal of research, especially by anthropologists originally. But then you get research by a number of historians, all of whom think conclude that he's basically wrong. And they investigate one or other of his concepts, often for Dahomey, sometimes for other places. So by 1973, actually, Polanyi's views, known by the way as substantivism, had pretty much been discredited. However, let me say a couple of things. One is substantivism. The ideas of Karl Polanyi are still arguably the most sophisticated version of the widely held proposition that economic behavior is greatly influenced by culture. And Max Weber said that economic activity is embedded in culture. And Polanyi is one example of the various theories that agree with that proposition. Others would be Marxism, for example, though not so much in culture. The second point is that many scholars, including Douglas North, who I'll refer to briefly later, the founder of the Institutional Economic History, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, Douglas North was also impressed by the subtlety of Polanyi's thought, but feared that it could not be tested, that it would not be testable in the way that, for example, Karl Popper argued that all scientific theories must be testable. To be precise, they must be refutable, according to Karl Polanyi. They must be falsifiable to be considered a scientific theory. And in this case, there is a very clever article written, sadly, quite a long time after substantivism had ceased to be the centre of attention, ceased to be fashionable. It often happens thus, I think, in academic life, that the best article comes out after the demand for it has really passed. But if you want to read a very good article testing Polanyi's theory, go to the Journal of African History in 1992. What Robin Law noticed was that there is a falsifiable proposition in substantivism, because Polanyi said prices are fixed in non-capitalist societies either by custom or command. Therefore, they'll be fixed. So what Law realizes, what you have to do is to gather all the scattered observations of prices in the pre-colonial 18th and 19th century Dahomey, and this the hard part was converting them into commensurable units, because they're in different European currencies, for example, constructing a price index, and the subtitle tells you his conclusion. Inflation in pre-colonial Dahomey. He found that prices kept changing, and also that there were two periods of major inflation, both of which, all this shows that Polanyi was wrong, and that about the case that he had chosen to study himself. So I think that is an example of where actually, even for the pre-colonial era, in a period where the data were pretty scattered, it is possible to do some interesting quantitative work and to use it to test what was a major theory, even though, as I say, it was one that had, to some extent, passed its sell-by the time the best article on it came out. If we come to the 1970s, let me mention a couple of major theories, both from the left. Up at the top, we have the two leading exponents of dependency theory in Africa. Walter Riley, whose book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, sums up the thesis in a single title. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is actually very light on theory. It's much more descriptive than one might expect. Samir Amin, Egyptian economist who spent most of his life based in Dakar, Senegal, he really elaborated the theory and particularly coined the idea of peripheral capitalism to encapsulate the proposition that capitalism in Africa was a kind of second-rate capitalism, where you had markets and things, but you found that the accumulation of wealth simply led to its export back to the capitalist core. So that's dependency theory, which was enormously influential in the 70s and 80s, particularly in Latin America and Africa, but also influential on Western campuses. Below those two, you have Catherine Kokruri-Vidrovich, again photographed much later in her career. She published in 1969 an article in French, which was the beginning of the French modes of production school writing about Africa. So these are, broadly speaking, more orthodox Marxists, not dependency writers, but they were interested in economic exploitation within Africa. And they asked themselves, how is it possible to extract surplus value in pre-colonial societies? So they wrote on various things. One of the results of that period of research in Paris is that the topic of slavery within Africa was really opened for serious research. In the first 10 to 15 years after independence, academics barely mentioned it. There was a lot of amnesia about slavery within, for example, 19th century Africa. I think really because nobody wanted to mention it in the context of decolonisation. Everybody, African or non-African, wanted to be positive and not discuss exploitation in its internal dimension. Anyway, I can talk forever about these two schools of thought, but it might be a good idea in view of the time to move on to a little more recent work. In the 80s and until the mid-2000s, you had something of a reduction in the rate of new research in African economic history. I think this was partly because of the prevailing pessimism about African economies at the time. You know, this was the era when The Economist published its notorious front cover about Africa, the hopeless continent. And you also had within the humanities, not really in social science, but within the humanities, a major shift towards cultural rather than material subjects of study. So the study of African economic history continued, but there was less new work being done. And some of the work that was being done during that period included obviously Law's article and a great deal of research on the numbers in the Atlantic slave trade. And also, and this is what I wanted to come on to since I want to talk about theory, the entry of new institutionalism or new institutional economics and political science into the study of Africa. So let me distinguish what I call first and second generation new institutional economic history. You know, some people might doubt whether some of the studies that I'm going to mention are truly historical, but they all are ostensibly about history. Actually, let me go up a step, since not all of you may have heard of new institutional economics. New institutional economics is essentially the project. Well, let's go back a further step. Robert Bates, I'm going to be talking about in a minute. Robert Bates offered a short history of new institutional economics, which may not be entirely accurate, but I think captures the essence of it. He says new institutional economics originated in a crisis of embarrassment within neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics, as the radical philosophy of individualism, actually rested on collective foundations. This was what was embarrassing. The theory of consumption, it's supposed to be about individuals, but it was actually, it's the household that is the main consumer. it's supposed to be about individuals, but most production is not done by individuals working by themselves. It's done by firms. So in the context of that crisis of embarrassment, Ronald Coase, great LSE and then Chicago economist, who, by the way, wrote extremely lucidly. If you ever want to read an economist who writes very clearly, I recommend Ronald Coase. So his first paper of interest was published in 1934, I think it was. It was about the question, why do firms exist? And he's really the founder of New Institutional Economics. Let's now come to economic history. I briefly mentioned Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize, was given the Nobel Prize in the late 90s. He was really the individual who, more than anybody else, used New Institutional Economics in the study of history. It was also influential in other disciplines, notably political science. And in the case of Africa, it was introduced by a political scientist. So New Institutional Economic History really began in many contexts, starting off with a book on Europe, but extending also to work on Thailand, for example, many other places, with one particular sub-theory. This is the theory that seeks to explain how institutions evolve. And again, I should have said, because some people won't be familiar with this, how do new institutionalists define an institution? According to them, Cambridge University is not an institution. The monarchy is not an institution. They're organizations. An institution is a rule. So the institutions are the rules surrounding economic activity, the rules that give order and predictability to economic activity. So one obvious question is, how do institutions evolve? And North and colleagues offered an evolutionary theory of this, which owed a lot to various Chicago economists. This was really the idea that if, let's say, land becomes relatively scarce, perhaps because of population growth, it will therefore become more valuable economically, providing there's a way to express that value. And the way to express it is in a price. And the way to make the price system work is to have something you can buy and sell. So the theory predicts that if land becomes scarce, you will see the development, you'll see the emergence of individual property in land, which can then be bought and sold. And that view was elaborated with regard to Europe in this 1973 book that I mentioned. And Douglas North, to his great credit, recognized that the book didn't sufficiently explain everything they were trying to account for. And very annoyingly, although he thought his theory fitted England extremely well, he recognized it didn't really fit Spain. And he spent the rest of his long career puzzling about this problem, puzzling about why the theory of induced institutional innovation didn't work as well as it should. That brings me to the introduction of new institutionalism to African studies by the American political scientist Robert Bates, who is still going, but his most influential work was published at the beginning of the 80s, and he published on pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial topics. But his best known thesis was expressed in a very short book of 1981, which was about the question, why have the states of tropical Africa not grown as fast economically since independence as their citizens expected, and indeed many economists, for what it's worth, also expected? He assumed, because he was a political scientist, he took for granted what was becoming then the orthodox economic analysis shared by the World Bank, that the basic problem was excessive state intervention. But as a political scientist, his question was why those policies were adopted, and especially why were they persisted with when they weren't delivering economic growth. Because his view was states, politicians are actually rational, despite appearances to the contrary, and if they make, anybody can make a mistake once, but if you keep repeating it, it can't be a mistake that you're repeating. You must have a reason for persisting with a policy that produces an apparently bad outcome. So his argument was that the states of post-colonial Africa were mostly characterized by urban bias, that they were run by urban elites who sought to reward themselves. Politicians sought to enrich themselves and their urban followers. And who was going to pay for it? Why, the agricultural exporters, producers of coffee, tea, cocoa, whatever it was. So the farmers, and particularly the agricultural exporters, would be the ones, directly or indirectly, paying the bill for relatively high standard of living for the ruling elite and the urban populations as a whole, poverty for everybody else. And an interesting thing, well, I'll come on to it, and a very interesting thing about Bates, it's his argument, but one immediate thing is, if you read that 1981 book, he didn't expect it to change. This was an example, according to him, of a stable, low equilibrium track. Or to put it in another way, it was a stable, high rent-seeking track. There was no reason, an equilibrium is a situation, at least in economics, a situation in which no one has an incentive to change their behavior. And the rulers didn't have an incentive to change their behavior. Because they're doing okay, they're still in power, they're rewarding their constituents. And Bates argued, very much like Karl Marx, about writing about the French peasantry in 1848, by the way. There are a lot of similarities between Marxism and rational choice economics. Bates thought that small peasants were incapable of organizing themselves to defeat their own exploitation because of the free rider problem, because they're very many in number, but small in average economic size. So each one of them would feel, if I take part in collective action, for example, refusing to pay taxes, it will make no difference, no noticeable difference, except that I'm likely to be very severely punished, so I'm not going to do anything. However, an interesting feature of Bates's argument was that he said that exceptions to this, there are two exceptions. Kenya and Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, had done well, they'd grown fast, where the other tropical African agricultural exporters had grown only slowly or not at all. He said these two outliers are exceptions that prove the rule. Because if you look at them, they're actually run not by urban elites, but by farmers. Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire had emerged as the leader of the cash crop farmers of Côte d'Ivoire during the colonial period. The person who, by the way, proposed the abolition of slavery, sorry, not slavery, that was 1848, proposed the abolition of forced labour within the French colonial empire in the French Liberation Assembly of 1944. Very interesting guy. Houphouët-Boigny was a cocoa farmer, a big one. So was Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, except that he got his large acreage really as a result of the redistribution of white settler farmers at the end of the colonial period, and he grew coffee and tea, not cocoa. But what they had in common was they shared with the mass of small agricultural exporters an incentive to have high producer prices, high prices to attract farmers to reinvest. And that, according to Bates, was why those two countries alone in tropical Africa had relatively fast growth of agricultural exports and by extension of the economy as a whole. So we'll come back to Bates's two outliers in a minute. Now, what about the problems of the first generation of new institutional economics? Well, the first one, in the case of Bates, is that history proved him wrong. This is the trouble about making a prediction. And if you actually go back to his book, his last paragraph, I have to say, is a bit mealy-mouthed. He obviously was getting a bit nervous, so he kind of offers a sort of way out of it. But the whole logic of the book is, this is a pattern of behaviour that is completely rational from the point of view of the rulers, and there's no pressure on them to change, so they'll continue. However, shortly afterwards, 1981 was the year in which the World Bank's report, popularly known after its chief author as the Bates report, so the Berg report, Elliot J. Berg, which essentially was the manifesto for structural adjustment in Africa. It says what we need is to roll back government intervention, to make a transition from administration of resources to market allocation of resources. Those policies known as structural adjustment began to come in almost the moment Bates had effectively predicted they would never come in, because it wasn't in the rulers' interest. But one after another, almost all the states of pre-colonial Africa adopted structural adjustment, which I think does refute his theory. And he came very close to admitting it in an article in 1991, without quite saying, well, he said, we've learned. He didn't quite say who's learned. One thing that Bates himself pointed out in a later work on a different subject, he wrote a theoretical piece in 1995, which commented that the basic problem of rational choice institutionalism is that it's actually fairly indeterminate. Because, and here I should have done a graph. If you have a status quo, and you have a Pareto Frontier, that's to say, a line above which any increase, you have a Pareto Frontier, you have two players, A and B, and if you move from that frontier upwards, by definition, somebody, either A or B, will be better off, but somebody else will be worse off. Below that frontier, it's possible to make Pareto gains that benefit both parties, or at least benefit one party without hurting the other. Now, Bates commented that the trouble is, the theory of induced institutional innovation, for example, says people will change their institutions in order to realize Pareto gains. But the trouble is that, and to do that, you move up to the frontier, you change your institutions so they reach the frontier. But, Bates commented, the two parties are unlikely to be indifferent as to the way in which you achieve that Pareto gain. Because along the frontier are different points, some of which are better for A, some of which are better for B. So you might both gain, but I might be very cross if I only get a tenth of the possible gain and you walk off with the other 9/10. So politics comes in. So this is where, as a political scientist, Bates says, these institutional economists are only telling one part of the story. That remains, I think, a really fundamental problem with the theory of induced institutional innovation. And one example from Thailand, there was a very good article applying the theory to the abolition of corvée, that's to say, compulsory labour for the state in Thailand. So when in Thailand land ceased to be relatively abundant and became relatively scarce, theory would predict that land would increase in value, people would buy and sell land, and they would hire wage labour instead of using some form of coerced labour, such as corvée. That's exactly what happened. However, Grabowski pointed out that if you run the clock forward to a few more decades of Thai history, in the Great Depression, the economic change was reversed. A lot of people emigrated back to India, out of Thailand, and land became more abundant. The value of land fell. So Grabowski says, so where is the reversion to corvée? Where is the reversion to forced labour? Answer, there was none, because it was politically impossible to turn the clock back. So that's an example of where a purely economic analysis is insufficient. I've also studied the end of slavery in colonial Ghana from this perspective. And it seems to me this is another case where the theory of induced institutional innovation is heuristic. That's to say, it's good for thinking with. It helps you formulate the problem. But its predictive value is very little. Between the 1890s, say 1896 was when Britain occupied Ashanti, or Asante in what's now Ghana. It wasn't until 1908 that the colonial administration actually abolished slavery in the sense of prohibiting it. So for 12 years it was still in place. What then made the difference? According to the theory, it ought to have been that land had become scarce. But in fact, according to my estimates, the area of land under cultivation probably increased by less than 1% in those 12 years. So the change can have been nothing to do with that. You know, the British administrators abolished slavery for other reasons, nothing to do with changing economic circumstances in the country. Second generation, new institutional economic history, if history is the word. You've had a great growth of research in the fields of African economic history since the mid-2000s. So over the last 15, 17 years, extraordinary growth. But on the whole, its major innovations have been in method more than in theory. And the majority of these studies have used essentially rational choice political economy without necessarily using the term. And in fact, they have used a combination of more ambitious quantification, but less sophisticated theory, which I think is a slightly risky combination. So you've had studies, these are only some of the studies, I mean, a whole range of different kinds of quantitative methods have been applied in the last 20 years. Some of them had been applied before, but more ambitious ones using previously underused sources. So you've had some relatively unambitious in statistical term studies, which I think tend to be very well founded quantitatively. But you've also had much more ambitious ones using extraordinarily long or using cross-country regressions, where you try and compare what's happened in all the countries that the United Nations today recognizes. You ask, how wealthy were they per capita in the year 1500? We don't know. And how wealthy they were in 1995. So ultra-long comparative statics is one part of it, and the use of instrumental variables is another, which is generally a good idea. Perhaps I'll leave that to questions. The theory, at the same time, has been simplified into very crude binaries, either or. So the models have tended to assume, to make the assumption that economic growth and economic rents are mutually exclusive. Either your economy is growing or your economy is characterized by rent seeking, that's to say essentially the capture of surpluses above what you would get under competitive conditions. For example, when government officials introduce import licenses and raise revenue, whether for themselves or for the state, simply as the price of their signature, which is not in itself productive but can be lucrative. It seems to me that most economic history shows the presence of both at the same time. And it's to assume from the start that they don't exist together, I think is very risky. The most famous of these works by Asimoglu, Johnson and Robinson, 2001 and 2002, the reversal of fortune thesis, they assume that there are only two types of European colonies. And I think historians will generally think there are at least six, and that it makes a big difference. They don't even count South Africa as a set of colonies, which joining South Africa is just completely bonkers, not to mention ignorant. They're not ignorant, they know what they're doing, but to me it's bonkers. And they also assume that all institutions are essentially either extractive or inclusive. Inclusive means that everybody who has not been previously dispossessed has a share in them. One must remember that the institution of property rights is a right to exclusive use of a resource for a particular purpose. So it excludes as well as includes. And this thesis, just as when thinking about 18th century England, the government that famously protected individual private property rights also abolished common property rights in the enclosure of the commons. And you have the same thing in Asimoglu, Johnson and Robinson's work. I'm sure some people in the room will have heard of this. This was the thesis, which sounds very dependency, that the European colonies that existed, so European colonies can be divided into two. Those that were characterized by hardly any indigenous people surviving and lots of European settlers. They experience a positive reversal of fortune, not the unfortunate indigenous population, of course, as a footnote admits, but the European settlers. In 1500, these areas considered to be poor. By 1900, they were the richest in the world, or among the richest in the world. Conversely, those parts of the world which were colonized by Europeans but ruled in other ways, without lots of settlers, they were, according to AJR, relatively wealthy in 1500 and poor by 1900. So that sounds a bit like dependency theory. But my interest is methodological, so here's some of the problems. To me, the biggest single problem, considering the AJR are comparing what they're using proxies for what the situation was in 1500, since nobody knows what the GDP per capita was of anywhere in 1500, certainly not the places that were colonized by Europe. And so they say, okay, what was the GDP per head by proxy in 1500? What was it in 1995? That's a 500-year gap. Now, of course, if causal relationships have remained the same over that 500-year period, then that could be perfectly valid. I mean, there might be problems with it to do with data, but the basic idea is perfectly valid. However, it's demonstrable that various very important relationships changed, causal relationships changed over that period. Take the example of cheap labour. In South Africa, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the gold and diamond mining industries prospered thanks to artificially cheap black labour. there's a neat little quantitative estimation that if the gold mining industry of South Africa had to accept even a doubling of black wages, and you say, doubling of wages, that sounds fantastic. But not when the gap between black and white wages was about 10 times. So doubling was something that the employers could actually easily afford it. Except that even that relatively modest increase would have meant that hardly any South African gold mines were profitable until the 1930s, when the dollar and the pound went off the gold standard and the price of gold shot up. So in that early period, cheap labour was crucial in economic development, and by extension, the use, direct and indirect, of coercion to obtain a artificial cheap supply of free labour, supply of cheap labour, could work and be profitable to the coercers. If you run the clock forward to the 70s, 80s and early 90s, by then the apartheid regime was no longer helpful for economic growth. On the contrary, the very same institutions that had helped it achieve economic growth in the late 19th, early 20th century had become brakes on economic growth. What the country needed, what the economy needed, was lots more educated labour at relatively low prices. But because of the education restrictions in the apartheid system, there was only a very small proportion of the population who were highly educated, and they were able to obtain wages way over what you would expect in had there been a better supply of educated labour. So this is an illustration of the proposition that causal relationships are not constant over periods of hundreds of years. At least they don't have to be. And in this case, they change considerably. Now, to be fair, that criticism which I made in a 2008 article, there are some studies of this kind, some studies that use essentially the same method on various things, which have tried to respond positively to my criticism that what you have in this method is a dangerous compression of history. A compression of history that obscures changing causal relations with results that make problems for the conclusions. Now let's go on to a different point. And this is a point that stems from the treatment, the way outliers, exceptional cases, are treated in recent new institutionalist work in studying the African past. You remember how Bates treated the two outliers in his story, that Kenya and Côte d'Ivoire were exceptions that proved the rule. So he asked, why was there this variation? And he seeks to explain that variation as part of his argument. All these so-called persistent studies have in common, everyone I've read anyway, that they tend to simply ignore the outliers. They just treat them as kind of random variation. And yet that's an extremely dangerous and misleading thing to do. So here's a concrete example. There were in the late 2000s, early 2010s, a number of papers which did an Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson type study, but they concluded that the key to economic growth was not having white settlers in large numbers. The key to economic growth was how many hundreds of years have you enjoyed centralized government? You can tell the authors were not anarchists. Hundreds of years of centralized government would give you a high GDP per capita in 2010. That was the proposition. One of these papers particularly interested me because it gave a lot of its cases were African cases. And I happened to meet the author at a conference, so I said, I'm particularly interested in your explanation of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has one of the longest histories of centralized government in the world. And yet, in your study, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. How can that be? Obviously, you're going to say, well, it's a study of a large sample, there's going to be variations. But I'd like to know if you could explain this variation. What was it about Ethiopia that means that it doesn't conform to the general prediction? He was absolutely astonished and had no idea that Ethiopia had hundreds of years of centralized government. I think this is the result of, I wouldn't say this was a piece of economic history, it's a bit of casual use of historical data and with results that can be quite distorting. By the way, I actually think there's quite a lot of truth in the argument that long histories of centralized government may be favourable for economic growth in the future. But the problem is you can't predict when. So Ethiopia, I know this is a very bad moment to say this after 2 years of civil war, but Ethiopia on the eve of its recent civil war was widely and plausibly considered a major African economic growth success story. From 1995, for 20 years or so, the economy was expanding at 8% a year, and various people predicted that it would be the first country in Black Africa to take off industrially. And I felt that on the economic situation, that was actually quite plausible. I did have an Ethiopian PhD student who told me all along there's a really high chance of civil war, which of course would mess things up, and sadly he's been proved right. So my methodological point is I do think you need to not just let outliers lie, you need to try and think about why they're outliers. Are they an exception that proves the rule, in the sense that they're a case to which the conditions in your model do not apply, and therefore you wouldn't expect the predicted outcome? And I've already noted the conceptual binaries in the theories underlying these various models. They omit, they exclude much of what we actually know, much of the complexity. So they are reductive. They're reductive, they're reductionist in the strict sense of omitting some of the data. And here's one additional new point. A lot of these works rely on ready-made databases that were made for other purposes and which have systematic biases within them. And to me, the biggest example is the use or misuse of a so-called ethnographic atlas compiled by a rather eccentric, in my opinion, anthropologist called Murdoch in the early 60s. Anthropologists generally consider that Murdoch's atlas is a load of dingoes' kidneys. But a number of economists, just because it's a ready-made database, you don't have to do anything, you can just use it, have used it, sometimes with results that do no harm, because we know that almost all pre-colonial African societies had some form of polygamy. So if you take a number from the Murdoch database, you're not going to mislead anybody. You can make up almost any number, but you'll be broadly right. However, on some other subjects, it is highly misleading, which is for a whole number of reasons, which I won't detail. And here we're coming close to the end, you'll be relieved to know. One problem, and I think it's a very serious problem, and that goes back to the reasons for your society's existence. The kind of criticisms I've been making, you can find them in print, but you won't see them in the top economics journals. The top economics journals have published some of the articles I've been criticising. And some of those articles have been subjected to devastating criticism. But the criticisms have not been noticed within the pages of the top journals. So, I mean, one example would be, that I haven't mentioned here, would be the work of Nathan Nunn on the consequences for economic growth of the Atlantic slave trade and other external slave trades. This is incredibly widely cited. I'm not interested here whether the thesis is actually correct or not, but the methodology is open to exactly the same criticism as I mentioned earlier of Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson. It compresses history and overlooks the demonstrable changes in causal relationships affecting economic growth that have occurred over the years. Now, here's the point. Nunn's model was subject to a replication test in 2011. And that replication test, by the way, is reproduced in a slightly updated form in an essay by Frankema, Ewout Frankema, Frankema, published in a book that came out last year, The Handbook of Historical Economics. I think it's chapter 21, which is called Why Africa is Not All That Poor. The replication test showed the following. Yes, according to Nunn's model, according to his data, they use only his data, in 1995, as he says, the more enslaved people you exported in the past, the poorer you would be. But if you run it back years before 1995, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there's no correlation whatsoever. And if you run the clock forward, is it forward after 1995, by the time you get into the 2000s, you find that the correlation is inverse. Supposedly, the more slaves you shipped out or walked across the Sahara, the richer you were in 2005 or whatever. I mean, that's nonsense too. My point is simply, this is an extremely unrobust article, despite its fame. But this has not stopped the author, who's a terribly nice bloke, and I've made exactly this point to him in a seminar, face to face, exactly like this. Very, very nice person. But he allowed the article to be republished without commenting that it had been subject to any criticism. And his own popular efforts on the internet tell the story as if there had never been any problems with it. And then there are other studies. So a couple of recent authors of persistent studies, Nikolopoulos and Papineau, they were subjected to, I think, really powerful criticism by two French economic historians, Cognot and Dupraz. Part of the problem, I suppose, was that their first article, which rubbished the use of the Murdoch database, was published in French in the journal Histoire et Mesures, 2015 or 16, if you want to read it. And has not as yet been, has never been translated into English, and most of the authors only read English. They also read Turkish, but not usually French. But that's not the only one. They also have a paper which critiques the way in which these two authors used luminosity data. So, as some of you will know, a very cool way of measuring economic prosperity is, if it's for a recent year, is to use the NASA data on luminosity, which can be analysed using GIS, resolved to a great deal of geographical density. The only trouble is, apparently, according to the people who do this stuff for a living, you really need to use the log of the luminosity data to achieve the rigorous results, and they didn't. So there, the differences they claimed to find largely disappear if you use the log. And that paper too, that was submitted by the authors to a top economics journal and appeared to be reviewed by none other than the authors of the article they were criticising, which is really not good practice. So I think one of the reasons why there's been a demonstrable decline in debate in economics journals is that at the top of the food hierarchy in economics, there is a tendency towards club-like behaviour, where articles within the in-group are more likely to be published than articles that criticise them, especially when they criticise them from outside and in a fundamental way. So let me leave it there. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Austin, for this fascinating presentation. So following this presentation, we'll be having a Q&A section for the next half an hour. For this section, I'd like to hand over to my friend Navia, who will be conducting the Q&A. Let me just grab a chat.
Thank you for your presentation. Shall I just start off with a couple audience questions and then I'll pitch it if anyone we have any?
Why are the criticisms not noticed by the top journals? Like, do you justify in any way the fact that they're not publishing what you say are rigorous criticisms, or you just don't advertise them and just ignore them?
The one case that I know well what happened, I mean, I should say none of my articles, I haven't submitted an article to any of these journals. I submitted top articles in economic history, not in economics. So this is the experience of other people. But in one case, an article was submitted to a top economic history journal. And this was the replication study of Nathan Nunn. Now, it could be that the problem was that their article was primarily about something else, was primarily about real wages in Africa. So I would say there was a legitimate possible argument that the replication test, although they did relate it, wasn't completely integral to the article. So if I was trying to defend that decision, that's probably the line I would take. But the author himself, I mean, Nathan Nunn himself said that he was a referee on the journal. One of the referees said this should be left out. And it was left out. So it didn't appear in 2012 in the top economic history journal. It appeared in 2000 and it was appeared as a working paper before, but it appeared again in revised form in a 2021 handbook chapter, which means it will be used a lot in teaching, at least in economic history, but it won't have the same impact on researchers, since researchers don't necessarily read handbooks. I would say in that case there could be a kind of rationale. I mean, it wasn't my article, I didn't read exactly what the reviewers or the editors said. But I think there might have been a possible rationale in that case. In the other cases, it seems to me, as far as I gather, that there weren't any very convincing reasons for rejecting it. The main rationale, though, is that many journal editors don't like publishing what they see as negative papers. So I gave a reference to a site, to a blog to be precise, of which a few years ago, an LSE economic history PhD student reported the results of his quantitative study on controversies in economics. So he'd been through loads of economics journals and looked for the frequency of words like frequency of words in titles like rebuttal, critique, rejoinder, and that sort of thing. And what he showed was that it had been a continual decline, at least since the 60s, and of a massive kind. Now, the tendency, I think, in economics is to say, well, this reflects the fact that we now have better methods than we used to. We're more like, economics no longer really aspires to be like physics, but it does aspire to be like medicine. So we're now doing all these experimental studies like the medics do, and using clever things such as instrumental variables, and so our results are safe, and therefore, what is there to debate? These are findings that are established. And certainly quite a lot of editors seem to think that if they publish what is simply a critique, that is not as interesting as publishing an article which offers a positive alternative view. So in fact, a colleague and I, a political scientist and I, are working on a critique of yet another set of persistent studies which attempt to which argue that the more armed conflict there was in your country in the period 1400 to 1700, the more armed conflict and poverty there will be in your country today. Now, this is all based upon a database that has spectacularly obvious sample biases. Our data, or our observations that we know about on warfare in pre-colonial Africa, almost all come from European sources. Where were the Europeans in 1500, 1600, or 1700? Answer, on the coast. So there is an absolutely gaping bias because they have few reports from the interior. Doesn't mean there wasn't lots of warfare going on, it just means the Europeans literally weren't in place to observe them. So there are other problems with these papers too, but in thinking about how we could raise this, because of the experience of other colleagues as I've described, we thought there's probably no point in submitting it to, in this case, the top political science journals in which the offending articles were published, but rather we will probably end up submitting to an economic history journal. We might change that if we can come forward with a more positive thesis, and actually that is just about positive. I mean, it's just about possible, because my colleague points out that the best predictor of levels of violence is population density. And strangely enough, the more people, the greater the possibility of organised violence, particularly as organised violence only counts as such above a certain scale, which might be quite hard to achieve in a very lowly populated society. So it is actually possible that we will offer a positive story. The danger would be that if the positive story isn't all that convincing, the article may be shot down, even though the critique is fully justified.
So you've talked quite a lot about how kind of specific papers have loads of issues and there's lots of kind of data issues. I was wondering if there's also a problem with kind of the fundamental economics that kind of has kind of been created in the West and therefore wouldn't apply to Africa, or is that not as much of an issue? Kind of the macroeconomics or micro that you learn in kind of everyday undergraduate studies, for example.
I would say the two things. I mean, on the general case, on the principle, I think that the substantialist formalism debate actually really showed that theories from market economics are applicable to even pre-colonial Africa. So I think so far nobody has really made a significant dent, even though it seemed intuitively very plausible in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And it's a natural question to ask right up to the present, but I don't think it's really true. I think market economics does work. However, the second point is what kind of market economics? There are, of course, all sorts of models. And even within the institutionalism, there are quite contrasting models of lots of things. So there's plenty of scope for debate within that. So I think I'd be optimistic, but it does depend on the details.
I also wonder kind of how did growing up in Africa and being around a very kind of different economy kind of shape, how does it, when you look at kind of other economists who've kind of, grown up here and lived in kind of more of a free market, neoliberal kind of model, how does that kind of change your perspective?
Well, I was born in Nigeria, but my parents left when I was 6. So my memories of that era are rather limited. The most exciting thing that happened was a steam train crashing through the buffers and blocking the road. But I taught in what in those days was called a Harambe school in Kenya. I taught maths in 1975. So I saw quite a lot of Kenya and travelled a great deal in Kenya and Tanzania then, and taught at the University of Ghana in 82 to 85, and did a great deal of travelling in West and West Central Africa. I certainly got extremely used to the kind of economies that were drastically changed by structural adjustment. Notably, if you travelled from here to London, the equivalent would be on the road, the vehicle you're in, especially if it's public transport, say a passenger lorry, might be stopped 10 times by armed men who might demand that everybody gets off and would search the bags, if it was Ghana, say, of all the market women, and extract bribes on the grounds that they were engaged in economic crime, namely trying to take foodstuffs or cloth from one area of the country to sell it above the controlled price in another. And it was a bit different it did vary from country to country. Roadblocks were less of a problem in Nigeria actually in that period. And they were also very intense in places like Burkina Faso for slightly different reasons. But I must say, I was in Ghana for much of the time when the economy shrank by 40% in 8 years. The economic crisis, shrinking by 40% in 8 years. That is a crisis. So my experience of structural adjustment actually in Ghana was extremely unusual in Africa. Ghana was the one case where structural adjustment it was immediately a success. I think, if you ask why, I think it was because it had the problem. Different structural adjustment was the solution. Structural adjustment being a one-size-fits-all solution. Lots of countries didn't have that problem, but Ghana did. So although it didn't solve every problem, it did solve the problem of economic shrinkage. It did reverse that. So you've got 8 years, indeed 40 years of growth following that. That has certainly hugely influenced my perceptions of Africa, and also because you can see what isn't apparent in the statistics, which is for example, roadblocks are perfect opportunities for bullying. So the guys with the guns can shout at citizens. This was actually quite comic. My favourite one was in Central African Republic in 1985, very remote area. And there was this, I'm not tall enough to do justice to this, but you may remember John Cleese, who's got very grumpy in his old age, but in his prime was extremely good at particularly the role of, he's I think about 2 meters tall, of being a tall man in a rage, and he realised there's something incredibly funny about watching a tall man in a rage. But I must say he was no funnier than this Central African Republic soldier who stopped the vehicle and told us, "Durable, descente!" Looking absolutely furious. All these people who, apart from me, were all citizens, who were doing nothing except travel from A to B. I mean, thankfully, the economic rationale for that kind of behaviour is much less common than it used to be, though certainly roadblocks are rife in certain countries. But I think, the trouble with control systems is that they give a lot of power to the people on the front line who enforce them. And if they're not disciplined, the results can be all sorts of abuses. They don't have to be. If you have a state whose people in uniform do what they're supposed to do and don't exceed their powers. But not many states in that period, particularly West Africa, were able to control their officials sufficiently.
Yeah, question back.
Just on the idea of the use of econometrics in the way the field's turned quite a bit towards that, do you see a reversal in that, or will it just kind of continue down that road of more mathematical models and econometrics in the, say, next few years?
I think I would answer in two parts. Within the economics profession, it seems to me there is a strong drive towards apparent technical complexity almost for its own sake. And that will continue. There's no reason why it should change. Because many of the readers, many of the people who cite Morgan Johnson and Robinson, or indeed Nathan Nunn, are not necessarily interested in the substantive historical conclusions. They're impressed by the method, certainly with HAR, and for some good reasons. I mean, it was a very clever study. So I think that probably will continue, and you have more and more, ever more powerful computers to help you. I hope there will be some reform in the sense of more attention to the quality of data and more attention to having theoretically plausible models, theoretically and historically plausible models, but I'm not all that optimistic. It may happen to some extent. And there was a study by Morgan of Trinity College Dublin a few years ago for some paper which reviewed loads of persistence studies and came to the conclusion that most of them suffer greatly from distortions resulting from the particular place in which they're set. In other words, lots of the reported results was actually simply a consequence of the physical place in which they happened. There is, however, a debate about whether that's entirely an accurate criticism. And I read a very good undergraduate dissertation. I mean, I'm in the history faculty, but I read a very good undergraduate dissertation in economics, which critiqued the critique of that. But that is the kind of paper that, because it's purely, in a sense, it comes across as purely technical, might be more widely read by some economists who like the techniques and are not really too interested in specific results. Africa features quite heavily in cross-country growth regressions, by the way, I think to a great extent because there are a lot of African countries. And that makes a big difference. India is a dead loss when it comes to these kind of studies. One big observation, that's just as many as the Gambia. But on the other hand, I mean, what we've already seen ever since the first of these came out is that there are lots of studies that are quantitative and indeed econometric in the sense that they might use regressions, for example. But which I would say are, I mean, everything can be criticised, everything has its weaknesses, but are very important contributions which will endure, and certainly endure for a long time. Very clever studies of real wages and living standards, for example, in many African countries over quite long periods of time. And I think in economic history, these studies are getting better because we do learn from critiques of previous ones. So I'm a little pessimistic regarding perhaps some members of the economics profession who are dedicated to persistent studies as a technique, and are not perhaps too interested in the substantive conclusions, and often will never read the historiography anyway, in many cases. But I'm more optimistic about strictly economic history studies.
So you kind of talked about structural adjustment, and so I was wondering, like, you've studied quite a lot of African history, and so what would your perspective be on kind of the role of international organisations in terms of policy making, and whether they help or harm Africa's development, and what's kind of your perspective on that?
Well, the World Bank and the IMF have both changed a lot over the decades. They have their own histories. So when the World Bank was set up, and the World Bank is probably more interested, well, actually, let me say something interesting about the IMF. The IMF traditionally, of course, it's interested in macroeconomic adjustment. Its purpose is to help you cope with a short-term shock. That's why I think the World Bank is more interesting, because it's concerned with long-term development. But the IMF traditionally has said to countries that are experiencing a big balance of payments shock, you've got to deflate, you've got government spending must be cut, etc., etc. And that's exactly what they told the East Asian countries in 1997, with results that were pretty bad, according to none other than Joseph Stiglitz, chief economist of the World Bank at the time, who famously critiqued later on the IMF, and also to some extent the bank. But interestingly, in 2009, in response to the Great Recession, the IMF told European countries to deflate, but they didn't tell African countries to do it. If you read the IMF's regional economic surveys of the time, they were actually saying to African countries, you need to be contracyclical, that's to say, if demand is going to contract in your economies, you should be spending more, not less. And African countries did that. I mean, I'm sure they wanted to do anyway, but at least that was the case when they didn't have to argue with the IMF. And they were correct. And the African countries actually got through 2009 on the whole pretty well, except for Botswana, which has experienced its first year of negative growth since independence. So the IMF has perhaps learned a bit from its own mistakes. The World Bank, you don't hear much about the World Bank in the context of African economic policy for quite a long time, because when it was founded, after all, it was called the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and its purpose was to help reconstruct Europe after the Second World War. Then Secretary of State Marshall came along and the US did the job itself. So no need for the bank. And in a spectacular example of mission creep, bureaucratic adaptability, the World Bank then reinvented itself very promptly as an organization devoted to promoting economic development in relatively poor countries. However, for many years, it was really engaged simply in infrastructure lending. It will give you a loan, as in the case of Ghana's Volta Dam. It will give you a loan for a big piece of infrastructure investment which you could guarantee will be paid off. but it wasn't taking risks itself, partly because it was run, its first few directors had come from Wall Street themselves, and they were borrowing from Wall Street, and they wanted to be able to reassure their friends that they'd be paying back. So this really only begins to change when McNamara became Secretary General, the very same McNamara who had been Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, US Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. He moves from that job to being two-time director of the, president of the World Bank. And he made the bank for the first time really interested in Africa and other economic development. So it's under him you get integrated rural development programs. And however, he also reintroduced economists into the bank, because believe it or not, the World Bank had actually closed its economics department at a certain point in the 50s. Can you imagine, all your friends in economics with no opportunity of going for jobs at the bank? By the end of McNamara's period, and McNamara was also very concerned to do something about poverty, to be fair to him, which was not conspicuously obvious with his predecessors, because they were really more worried about the bank's own financial credibility. So, he did change lending so that it had to be on pro-poor programs, at least that was the idea. But I think shortly before he stepped down, structural adjustment began to come in. And it was certainly very important in Latin America and in Africa. I think it was nothing like so important in Asia, because even when, as in India in 1991, it was adopted, it was much later than in Africa and Latin America. The Indian government basically refused to let the more extreme measures be adopted, which is why India to this day has fertilizer subsidies, which arguably is a very bad thing these days because of the environmental consequences of subsidizing such a fossil fuel high item as fertilizers. But at the time there was a logic to it in sustaining the Green Revolution. But I think in Africa and Latin America, unquestionably, it was extremely important. In Latin America, on the whole, pretty disastrous. In Africa, I think it varies. The short run view, the next 10 years, like the immediate few years before, could be years where, at aggregate level, as in the graph which showed at the beginning, they're years either of stagnation or of actual economic decline, not as I mentioned in Ghana, but in the majority of countries, and therefore in aggregate, on average. So the question there is, was that because of structural adjustment, or was it because this was an extremely difficult period for African economies, because the terms of trade internationally were moving radically against African economies? And if you're going to adopt a policy of economic liberalization, encouraging your exports of agricultural and mineral products, ideally you choose a time when world prices were rising, not falling. So it was a very bad time for it. So that would be one counter. The other thing is, I have to say, if you look at the period in the graph from 1995 onwards, the period of rapid growth, what had changed since structural adjustment in terms of the policy regimes? Very little. So although the World Bank by 2000 was quite prepared to accept that it had made mistakes, actually if it held on a little bit, it could have said, well, if we were to blame for at least part of the lost growth of the decade from 1985 to 1995, we should get part of the credit, again not all the credit, but part of the credit for the rapid growth since 95. Other parts of the credit would go to the fact that world prices were going in the right direction, thanks above all to the Chinese economic takeoff. I think the last thing I would say is, of course, one shouldn't assume that structural adjustment policies were always adopted against the wholehearted opposition of the recipient countries. I think they were where there was a huge international debt, as in Latin America. But you've got to remember that very few African countries had significant debts at the beginning of the 1980s. Particularly, they didn't have significant debts to commercial banks. Why? Because even the optimists in the international commercial banking community, like Lloyds Bank, which lent huge sums of money to Argentina, Lloyds would not lend to African countries because they didn't think they'd be paid back. They got it badly wrong with regard to their lending to Latin American countries. The effect of that was the Latin American countries were saddled with huge debts, which then, of course, became, as we would now say, toxic when the Volcker shock happened and US interest rates shot up. African countries, with a few exceptions, hadn't been able to borrow from commercial banks. And Ghana had even repudiated most of the debts it did have. The exceptions were those that had been able to borrow because they were doing well in the 70s, Kenya, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire. So in their cases, there was a bit of that. But I think the Kenya case is the one I know best. I don't think it's very, it was mainly because of that. The other thing is, there is always, I think, domestic reasons for doing something that involves an international deal. And it's very easy and misleading to overlook African agency. So in the case I know best, Ghana, the regime that was in power, that introduced structural adjustment, really didn't want to do it. It had come to power in order to make the quantity controls, the price controls work. But after a year of trying, it had come to the conclusion that all that was happening was that the economy was continuing to tank. So they sent an expedition, they sent missions to China and to the USSR. As it happens, one of my undergraduate students was on each of those trips. And the Chinese said, sorry, we don't have the money to help. The USSR were more forthcoming. We don't have the money to help. We recommend that you approach the IMF and the World Bank. So that was the advice from the other side of the Cold War. And so I think for very pragmatic reasons, a left-wing government in Ghana adopted structural adjustment. And you can, in a sense, tell their lack of enthusiasm for the project in the fact that structural adjustment is, after all, pro-market. But there's a difference between being pro-market and pro-business. And the rest of the years, when Jerry Rawlings, under whom structural adjustment had taken place from May 1983 onwards, under a different name, Jerry Rawlings stays on to 1992 when he gets himself elected as first civilian president of the Fourth Republic of Ghana. 2000 he steps down. Throughout that time, I think I'm right in saying he did not have a single meeting with the organised representatives of Ghanaian business. That was how interested he was in the opinion of business people. He thought that for pragmatic reasons, you have to let the market back in. And certainly many of his colleagues hoped that they would be able to reverse that after a few years, that it would be like Lenin's new economic policy, a parallel of which they were very well aware, the leadership of the People's National Defence Committee, PNDC government, to introduce structural adjustment, where Lenin had, faced with economic collapse, had said, okay, well, let market forces operate in agriculture for a few years so that the grain starts flowing again to the towns. And they did that, but it was only ever meant by the Bolsheviks to be temporary, and of course, Stalin reversed it drastically and brutally. That reversal never happened in the case of structural adjustment, so we're still with it. But I think in some cases, it was forced upon very unwilling governments. But in other cases, governments didn't want to do it, but they did it because, for example, they were faced with a revenue crisis. And government revenue had shrunk to a few percent of GDP in Ghana at the time it adopted structural adjustment. You really can't do much as a state in that no circumstances. So there are really powerful reasons for doing something that would at least allow government revenue to recover. So I'm not suggesting the Ghana story is typical. In fact, on the contrary, I've stressed it's unusual in its success, and I think it was unusual in the people who carried it out on the Ghanaian side. But it does illustrate a broader point that African governments' views also mattered.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation and answering all our questions. It was really, really interesting and we learned a lot. And thank you so much for everyone to coming to CSET, our last event of the term. It was really, really enjoyable. Thank you, Professor Austin.
Thank you very much.